You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers and the paths they've taken to help shape our everyday lives. Hello, I'm Rob Webster. I'm an Associate Professor here at the IOE. On this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Dr. Kate Cowan. Kate is an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the UCL Knowledge Lab, and she is an early years specialist. Her research interests include creativity, literacies and digital technologies, and the methodologies researchers use to collect data on play. Kate's current research includes a project called Playing the Archive, for which she has been spending time observing children's play in playgrounds. We're going to chat to Kate today about the importance of play, how she researches it, and what impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on both. Kate, hello, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, hi, thanks for having me.
Kate, before you joined UCL IOE, you were a nursery teacher. Is that where your interest in play originated?
I think it might even have been before that, actually. I did an early years focused degree on English and education, and as part of that, we were asked to do research. And my research looked at children's play and literacies and how what they were doing in the playground matched up or didn't match up to the experiences that they were having in classrooms. And I think that was where the spark for research was actually ignited, was kind of partly in the classroom, but also recognising that interesting things were happening in the playground too.
You used the term literacies there. Do you mean that in a different way to, reading and writing and so on?
Well, I think I started off with an interest in children's literacy. So my first degree was English and education. I was interested in English. I thought that was, reading and writing and seeing literacy in quite a narrow way. But actually, it was probably through those experiences of looking at children's play, listening to the rhymes that they were singing and the role play that they were enacting, that actually I realised that was all part of literacy too. And it didn't come under the banner of language. So I was interested in the way that children were using objects and their bodies and the space and musicality and all sorts of other things that sort of don't typically fit into our definition of literacy. And so, I do tend to talk about literacies a bit more broadly now.
So those are methods of communication. So those are very important to children, aren't they? That's primarily how they are getting along in the world.
Completely, yeah. And I think, yes, there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between what school literacy involves and these much wider, broader, richer literacy practices that children have at home. So that's been a strong theme of my work.
So, Kate, tell us a bit about your journey from working in nurseries to working in universities, from being a teacher to a researcher. How did you end up at UCL?
So, I'd always had this sort of interest in research, actually, but I hadn't wanted to go straight from undergraduate into master's into PhD. I'd felt quite strongly that I wanted to get actual lived experience in the classroom and know what it was like being a teacher. So I did a PGCE and I taught in an early years classroom in a nursery school for several years. And it was during that time that I think I was always kind of interested in the idea of doing research, and I would see little fleeting moments in things that the children did, and I would think how fascinating they were, but in the busy, bustling energy of an early years classroom, there wasn't always the time to focus on them in detail. So I first of all started by doing a master's part-time alongside my teaching, and I looked at children's communication multimodal literacy. So that's the word that I use to describe the sense that literacy is about more than language, that we're interested in children's gaze, gesture, body movement, actions, use of objects, and so on. So I looked at that in my own practice. I researched my own practice as a nursery teacher. And then a couple of years after that, I was lucky enough to get a PhD studentship working on a project called Mode at UCL Knowledge Lab, which was directed by Kerry Jewett and was looking at the methods that we need to research multimodality. So I applied it to the context of the early years classroom, but I was working alongside researchers who were looking at very different contexts like museums and hospitals and so on.
That's really interesting. So you have experience of working with infants and academics. So I'm kind of wondering which is harder. Is it more difficult working with needy attention seekers or 3-year-olds? I'm only joking.
No comment, probably. I think I'll be diplomatic and sit on the fence with that one. But I mean, it was a great career because early years classrooms are so unpredictable and energetic, and there's nowhere else like them. And I do still miss it. And I try to keep connected to classroom practice, actually. So I'm still a member of organisations like a trustee for a children's charity, and that takes me into contact with teachers. And I hope that that adds a richness to my research as well, is that I know what it's like in the classroom. I know the challenges and the amazing, wonderful moments. And I can hopefully try to speak more authentically to teachers about research than perhaps if I hadn't had that experience.
It's difficult, isn't it, in those kinds of contexts to be able to do both, to research and to teach. So as you've indicated, you bring an authenticity to it, which is greatly appreciated, I think, by the research community and practitioners as well, when you go back into those settings to talk about your work. Let's talk a bit about play then, children's play. So it's an important thing to study. Tell us why it's an important thing to study, and perhaps in your answer, you could define play for us as well. What do we mean when we talk about play?
Yeah, I think play is notoriously difficult to define, and that's perhaps partly what makes it interesting. So it's been approached from so many different perspectives. You get the biologists talking about play from a kind of evolutionary point of view, psychologists talking about its role in development, philosophers talking about it being a kind of expression of being. And there's also lots of different ways of defining it too. So some people try to categorize play down into different types or define its particular characteristics or think of a spectrum from play to non-play. So that makes it a really interesting topic and also quite a tricky one to define. But there's a definition from the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, which states that play is a child's right. And they define it as any behaviour, activity or process initiated, controlled and structured by children themselves. And I like that because it really places the attention on the children as the protagonists of play. And yeah, it's something I've been thinking about a lot because I'm currently doing some work for an organisation called Five Rights, and they've asked me to do a review of play literature, which is enormous, but thinking about whether we can say what an essence of play looks like to children, what its kind of qualities, what kinds of qualities play has. So some of the characteristics that are sort of coming out of that, particularly based on children's own views of play, are that it's something you do voluntarily, it's something open-ended that you can kind of quit when you want. It's something normally done without the involvement or presence of adults, if we're talking about like child-led play rather than play that maybe adults put into practice in an educational context. And also increasingly interested in this idea that play is transgressive. So it's not always kind of innocent and lovely and problem-free, but actually play can kind of sometimes be quite rebellious, quite dangerous, risk-taking. And I think we have to honour that side of play as well when we research it.
It's a very open-ended definition. I suppose it necessarily has to be, because play looks different, but it looks different for different children and probably at different stages of their schooling as well. So does that definition, does that work around play extend beyond primary school and into secondary school? The way you've been describing it makes me kind of wonder, when does play stop when you're a child?
Yeah, and when does it start? So I've recently been reading some of Colwyn Trevarthen's work, and he says that actually very young babies have a kind of intent and they're active in their movements and their response to rhythm, and actually he would see that as being play. And even earlier than that, kind of in utero, he would say that we can perhaps say that babies are playing before they're even born. And then at the other end of the sort of, if we're talking about childhood as going from 0 to 18, what does play look like for teenagers? So I think actually we found on one of our research projects that older children sort of would say, no, we don't play, and they would almost be a bit too cool for that term. But they did appreciate, having time to relax and hang out with their friends. So I think, we perhaps need to think about how children use the term play themselves or don't. And I think increasingly for older children and younger ones too, it's thinking about the role of digital technologies in their play and how central they often are to children's play experiences now.
So if we just think about the early childhood, the early years, can you tell us what the research tells us about the role and the impact of play in those early years of childhood, and what the kind of key messages, if you like, from the research evidence is around play?
Yeah, sure. So it depends again, sort of who you ask. I mean, there's a big tradition of psychologists looking at play from a developmental perspective, and it's been suggested that play has a really strong role to play in all kind of areas of development, really. So cognitive development, emotional development, social development, physical development. I come at it from a little bit of a different angle. So that's quite a sort of, sometimes it's critiqued, that role, for thinking about how play is instrumentalized by adults or co-opted. So play is seen as being good for something else. I try to look more at the kind of what play means for children in particular. And so I think play is actually really important for children's well-being. And it's an important way that they can exercise choice and control and agency in ways that might normally be limited in other spheres. So for me, it's interesting that play is interesting because it's the way that children explore and respond to the world, and it makes their interests and their thoughts and their feelings evident. And as we as adults can learn an awful lot by observing and listening to them in their play. But there is then this role as well for kind of playful learning. So rather than very formal, traditional based teaching, there's definitely an argument to say that we can make experiences in classrooms more playful, more enjoyable, and give children more choice and freedom and agency. But I think we need to balance that with this kind of need not to hijack children's play and overlook play's kind of more complex and challenging sides too.
There is a bit of a debate about that, isn't there? The role of play and how far it should go with young children. And there is perhaps a sense in which even the term sort of child-centred gets a little bit, I don't know, in some circles, perhaps a little bit of a bad reputation. Can you just sort of perhaps summarise for us some of the debate around that? To what extent that children's early experiences of nursery and schooling should be, around play, and what other things might be being, competing for attention in those early years.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely well-meaning. Lots of educators sort of are looking to implement learning through play, and I think that's definitely preferable to the kind of alternatives of very formalized traditional methods. But I think there is a danger then that that's actually not considered play to children on their terms, because if it's not spontaneous, if it's planned by an adult, if it's got a set outcome in mind, by those kind of definitions that we were talking about earlier, it wouldn't actually be considered to be play, not from a child perspective probably. So I think it's a need to kind of recognise that there is a role for this child-led and free play, and not to sort of overstate the adult-led side of play, which there also is a role for, but to kind of give play its recognition in a very broad sense.
So you're currently working on a project called Playing the Archive. Can you tell us a bit about the aims of the study, your role in it, and just explain that title for us as well?
So Playing the Archive was a project that ran from 2017 to 2019, and it was funded by the EPSRC, the Environmental and Physical Sciences Research Council. And that project was interested in researching archive spaces and technologies for play. And the archive in question is an archive of play collected by two folklorists, Iona and Peter Opie, who were meticulous collectors of children's play and games. And from about the 1950s onwards up until the 1980s, 1990s, they had correspondence with children and teachers about the games that children were playing in streets and playgrounds. And they had a few children's drawings sent to them of games and playthings. And they also collected, Iona Opie in particular, collected recordings from the school playground of children's rhymes, clapping games, chasing games, and so on. So the project was partly about digitising part of that archive that was in boxes in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and making those publicly accessible online to researchers and others interested in play. It was also interested in spaces and technologies for play, so thinking about how play has changed over the years since the Opies were creating their archive. And we looked into that by researching children's playground play today. So the strand of the project that I was involved in was the London fieldwork, and there was parallel fieldwork happening in Sheffield. But John Potter and I carried out fieldwork in London schools, working with children as co-researchers really, to tell us about their play. And we found that, kind of contrary to a lot of popular belief, that actually traditional play is still alive and well. They said it in the Opies' day too. They thought that children's play was kind of dying out, was at risk of destruction from things like TV and film. And we hear that today repeated in relation to video games and things. But actually, we found that there were really very kind of traditional play and games happening, but they were also kind of layered with different ingredients or cultural resources from children's lives today. So there was mentions of the 2018 World Cup when we were watching them play, and their favourite YouTubers, and the computer games that they were playing, and they were sort of often layered on top of like traditional game, local legends, family practices, and so on. So it was a complex picture that we uncovered through our fieldwork there.
Speaking of, I believe a phone booth has popped up at the IOE.
Yeah, that's right. It's one of the outputs of the Playing the Archive project. We worked in collaboration with the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis, part of UCL, on ways of getting the archive kind of brought back to life for children today and parents today to play the games of the past. So the phone box was an idea that was developed with children from the case studies, from the fieldwork that we carried out. we kind of brainstormed with them, how could we get these interesting bits of paper from the Bodleian Library and kind of bring them to life? And working with them, what we did was they read some of these aloud and recorded them onto a system where there's an old rotary telephone inside an old red phone box, and if you dial a particular number, you will get a rhyme from back in the sort of 50s, 60s, or a description of a game. And that was an installation that was part of the V&A Museum of Childhood in the summer of 2018 as part of a festival of play that we held there, which was a celebration of play in all its glory and play of the past, play of the present. And since the Museum of Childhood is now closing and being redeveloped, it's been moved into the IOE foyer. So if you're interested in finding out about the outcomes of the project, a little bit more about it and the OP archive itself, then you can go and dial an OP game of the past.
So I'm really curious about how you go about collecting these data. You mentioned just then that you work with children as co-researchers. So tell us first of all how you go about bringing young children into the research process and then what they add to it.
Yeah, I think it's one of the challenges of researching play is that, unlike other forms of social research, perhaps, where you could kind of try to become an insider or blend in into the situation that you're researching, actually, it's really impossible when you're an adult trying to research children's play because, you're just physically a different size and they're not going to, as playful as you might be, they're always going to see you as an adult. So I think we have to kind of recognise that children are the experts and acknowledge that and even say that to them, say, we're really interested in what you do here because we don't know about it. And so that's kind of what we did was we approached a group of children and our core group of researchers child researchers were in year 5, so they were 9, 10 years old. And we asked them to help us research the playground. And we explained to them about who the OPs were. We showed them some examples from the archive to show that, people are really interested in these games. And maybe in 50 years, 100 years, people will be finding out about your play and they'd be really interested in it too. So we tried to explain it in kind of child-friendly means. We always gave them the chance to opt out if they didn't want to be part of it, of course. And we gave them a range of methods too. So we kind of, a second big challenge of play really is that it's not easy to research using traditional tools. So interviews, questionnaires, they have their limits. If you're interested in something that's very physical and embodied and energetic and dynamic, I think you need methods and methodologies that will support you looking at that kind of activity. So we used a lot of video in that project, and that included giving children video recorders. So they would give us tours of their playground using iPads. They sometimes wore wearable GoPro cameras while they were playing, clapping games, things like that, and going on slides. And we also invited them to give suggestions of what methods we could use. So they suggested that we took some really big pieces of paper out into the playground and drew the playground and the games that were happening there and kind of mapping it. So I really like that kind of participatory research with children. I think it was a great way for us to kind of try and get to some of these parts of play that we wouldn't normally see as an adult outsider. And I think these multimodal methods as well, this range of different tools that we used, meant that we had a variety of perspectives on play too.
Have you found out anything about how children organise the play space? I'm just thinking about the playground when I was at school, and there were kind of bits of it that but the whole time I was there, always seemed to be used for the kind of the same thing. There'd be kind of girls over there playing, clapping games. There'd be that's where the boys play football. There'd be another group over here, and I don't mean to kind of sound like I'm sort of stereotype or anything, but there would just seem to be certain activities going on in certain parts of the playground. I just wondered whether or not when the children are communicating the physical space and the activities, whether you see any patterns like that.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, the tours that they gave us often were really enlightening because there would be tiny little things in the environment that we wouldn't have noticed, but they would have great significance to the children. Like there was a sort of little bit of metal sticking out of the concrete somewhere, and they took us over there and said that's the buried treasure and that sort of thing. So there were these kind of legends built up around the space. Another one was there was an old caretaker's house that was empty, and they said, oh, that's where the Green Lady lives. And then we got all these ghost stories about this Green Lady ghost who'd been there for, it turned out, decades. The story had been going because John, the co-researcher on this project, actually used to teach in this school, and he remembered the Green Lady from his day. So yeah, absolutely, kind of the space was full of these sort of different memories and shared understandings about what the space was used for.
That's really interesting. Let's just talk a little bit about what's been happening recently. So, as we record this, the UK is emerging from lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and schools are beginning to open more widely to some year groups, including young children in the reception years and year one. And also, very recently, the cordon tape has been torn off public playgrounds and they've been allowed to reopen with rules. So we're probably looking at at least for the short term, a different world in which play is taking place. So what do you think, first of all, the effect of limiting play spaces and opportunities have been over this course of lockdown, which has gone on for quite a few months, the spring and summer months?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. It's something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment because, of course, it's had a huge impact on all of us. But in terms of children's play, schools and playgrounds have been closed. There's been restrictions on times that they can spend outdoors and restrictions on who they can play with, having face-to-face contact with others outside their household. So we're interested, John and I, in potentially doing some more research on this. But so at the moment, what we've got is sort of anecdotal evidence, anecdotal stories about what's been happening. But it certainly seems like the virus has become a theme in children's play in some instances. So we've heard examples of children playing kind of coronavirus tag, so you're pretending to pass on the virus. I think that featured in The Guardian as one of the letters. And there was also a survey done in Ireland recently of parents of children aged 0 to 10, and they said that there was a lot of playing doctors, playing dead, building hospitals, even with kind of ventilators made out of Lego, things like that. Close attention to like washing their dolls' hands. And so definitely I think we're seeing traditional play. We would expect to see traditional play kind of adapting and responding to the social context that it's happening in. So play as being a sort of way that children are exploring these new and maybe troubling ideas, but keeping them at kind of a safe distance through their play. And then we're also seeing examples of kind of new games and adaptations of games. So I think just before children went into lockdown, there were stories of, playing things like shadow tag. So rather than actually physically touching each other, because that was, becoming a problem, they were tagging each other's shadows so they could keep at a distance. And playing games like helicopter tag as well, where apparently you stretch your arms out wide in order to make sure that you're keeping a safe distance from one another. So really inventive kind of responses to the restrictions on play. And then also there's the whole kind of strand of online play and digital play. While you're physically restricted, most children have access to digital tools and technologies that will support different kinds of play. So we've been hearing about games played across Zoom with grandparents and relatives. So hiding the iPad somewhere and playing hide and seek with your family while they're on Zoom, or doing like a version of Kim's game where you turn off your camera, then you change something in the background behind you and you see if the other person at the other end can spot what it was. So I'm just always constantly amazed, I suppose, by the adaptability and the evolution of games. And lockdown has been particularly interesting to me, but we're still working out exactly how best to access it.
I think that's fascinating because it shows the imagination and the creativity to adapt to something which is very serious. And it seems not be too intimidated by it either. I mean, the idea of a global pandemic, it could be very scary for children. But I wonder whether any of this is a bit of a coping mechanism. Part of them trying to sort of just process this very different world, and even if they don't get the virus, they still have to adhere to the social distancing and so on. Whether any of this is
Yeah.
just sort of a way of just coping.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that play is interesting because it's sort of got one foot in the real world and one foot in an imaginary pretend world. And that's a very interesting kind of liminal in between space that means that you can play with ideas kind of safely because you can step back out of them and say, well, let's just play. So yeah, play is absolutely used in kind of therapy and dealing with anxiety and trauma and that sort of thing, and has been done for a long time. And I think it would absolutely be plausible to think that's going on right now, that children are using play as a means of safely they're using play as a means of safely understanding and exploring and responding to some quite troubling ideas at the moment.
Do you think this will lead to or introduce any methodological changes to the work that you do in terms of how you go about researching this? Because it's, as you've been describing, it's a very not difficult, so it's a very different and interesting context. And the children, you've been introducing them into that process. So I'm just wondering whether you've been kind of giving any thought to how you kind of capture this.
Yeah, I mean, lately there's been quite a lot of discussion about it on Twitter. So people have used a hashtag of kind of Corona Play, and I found that fascinating that parents are sort of uploading these examples. But I think the trouble then is that it is mediated by parents, and it would be really great to try and get children's own responses to this and children's accounts of what the pandemic meant to them and how it affected their play. So yeah, we're thinking about a couple of different methods, John and I, and we would love to do a kind of a survey, almost in the kind of spirit of the OPs, and collect a kind of archive of play, that a time capsule almost of sort of pandemic play, what it looked like. I think that would need adults to upload examples on behalf of their children, but then perhaps also to do a kind of online ethnography, online fieldwork with children. So some case studies where we actually work closely and look deeply at examples of play, and that would be more relating to children themselves. But I think for the time being, there are challenges around getting back into the playground in the same way that we did on Playing the Archive. So we're having to think imaginatively about ways that research can look a bit different for the time being, at least. Hopefully we'll get back there soon, one day, when it's safe.
As I was preparing for the interview, I couldn't help thinking about Ring a Ring a Roses, which is often interpreted as a reference to the plague. And you've given some wonderful examples of what might be in the archive of the future. I particularly like the hide and seek with the iPad. Have you got any other examples of interesting games?
There's been a bit of a phenomenon for putting teddy bears in windows here, at least. I don't know if that's been totally widespread.
Yeah, we've been doing that as well, actually. Yeah, I think might have started in New Zealand, that, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting because it's almost like a sort of way of playing at a distance with neighbours and in your local environment, and almost kind of like gamifying the local neighbourhood, so that when you go on a walk, you've got this focus, whether it's that or spotting rainbows that have been painted and so on. I think what we might see is quite a shift in thinking around digital play, because actually been a kind of bit of a sea change. So the World Health Organization, not that long ago, has sort of been talking about game addiction and this real problem of digital play. Whereas now, under lockdown, there's been actual campaigns to try and get people playing online more so that they stay home and stay safe. And they had a campaign that was sort of around play apart together, and then another one around play and talk, sort of supporting mental health. So it's been interesting that there's been this swing to sort of actually now saying there's a place for play and there's a value to digital play that had been problematized before. So I wonder if we might see a bit of a shift in terms of how we perceive this word that I don't like, screen time. And actually, rather than sort of thinking of it as something that's black and white and we need to limit it because it's very problematic, actually thinking about what it can do well, how it can foster play with people who are distant to us, or how it can be a playful medium in itself that offers different things to traditional physical play. So I think that might be one change that we see in terms of play.
I just wonder whether, as you're saying that, whether we as adults have been challenged because our work has had to adapt and we've had to use screens even more than we're accustomed to. And maybe that's making us think a bit more, having a bit more of a relaxed view about the value of screens, particularly when you're having to work at home. You need a little bit of space to get some work done, and you might have young children like me, in which case you were very, very happy when Disney decided to bring forward the release of their streaming channel.
Yeah, and I think for adults too, apparently the sale of kind of Nintendo Switches has rocketed and the use of TikTok has gone right up. And I think that might be for, adults as well, sort of looking for playful ways to distract themselves, to have some enjoyment while we're kind of physically more restricted.
So play is good for everyone, however young or old you are. Kate, it's been really interesting talking with you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast and sharing your work. And we wish you all the best with your research going forward.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thanks.
You can follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Cowan, and you can learn more about her research via the links in the episode notes. Search for IOE podcasts from wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find episodes from seasons 1, 2, and 3 of Research for the Real World, as well as other IOE podcasts. We've had some fascinating guests on this podcast, a real variation in topics and expertise across the social sciences and education. There's some great listening there for you to get you through the summer months. And if it's a musical interlude you're after, there's our Spotify playlist too, featuring songs chosen by our guests and the IOE podcast team. All of that is accessible via our UCL webpage. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Rob Webster. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.